Good morning, everybody. Mike asked me in the middle of the week to move from doing this for Sunday Club to doing this for the whole church. So what I'm going to be sharing with you is a PowerPoint with a variety of links that I truly hope work, and we can experience World War I, or at least what you would experience if you went to Belgium. So I'm just going to share some stuff with you. This is sort of came about in my mind because I was supposed to have been in Belgium twice this year, and I haven't been at all, which I am really missing. But I thought I could do it this way for the kids, and ultimately for you guys to see what I would have been seeing. So for most of us, sort of assuming there is a knowledge of World War I, but just a little brief rundown. A 4-year war that killed far too many people, was fought mainly in a set of trenches, with lots of quite new weapons as well as old weapons that just nobody had the defence against, which meant, fortunately, that you end up with quite a lot of cemeteries. So where exactly would we be going if we were going to Belgium? Well, we'd be getting on a bus and then getting on a boat, which is a load of fun. And we'd be going to the town of Ypres, which is at the top of the map, the sort of red circled area at the top. And then we'd be going to a place called Arras and down to the very bottom arrow, which is the area of the Somme, which many of you might have heard of as the 1916 big battles. So it's not too far apart. The actual Western Front ran from Dunkirk in the north to Switzerland in the south, but I can't go that far with a bunch of teenagers in a bus or a bunch of church people in a bus. And so what am I going to be showing you? Well, you can, when you're in Belgium, you can go to lots of different sites that actually show you where the soldiers were, so the soldiers' experience. We're going to have a look at some tunnels, some cave areas that you can go to visit. We're going to have a look at some of the museums, and then the cemeteries and some of the memorials. And we're going to finish by watching a Menengate ceremony, which is the big ceremony that happens in Belgium every night. So one of the first things you notice about Belgium is how unbelievably flat it is. So Belgium is incredibly flat. This is just an example of an area around Ypres where we're going. And really what you can ultimately see straight away is that there is very little shelter and shade, and is one of the main reasons for the trenches. The real problem with Belgium is not only is it flat, but it's quite boggy as well. So as soon as they dug down, they hit water, not just mud. But that's where we're going to be going in terms of where the battlefield was. So we're going to have a look at a first set of trenches. Now this is called the Yorkshire Trench, and it was actually dug up about the sort of middle of the 1980s. They found it, and they've now have a look at that, and you should now be able to see this replica set of trenches, and you can see how skinny it is, how thin it is. The sandbags or the concrete matches where the sandbags were, and I usually take the kids round and they can have a look. Trenches were in a zigzag pattern to stop a bomb going off at one end and ripping right through the trench. So they're quite narrow, quite thin. You can't really pass somebody, which is a bit of a danger, obviously. Looking over in that direction would be where the front line would be, towards the German trenches, because it's higher. You know that because it's higher. And actually this one had a dugout that you used to be able to, you can't go down it, but in 1914-15 it was able to be going down. So that's one set of trenches. So this next set, really, kids, if you're still with us, this is definitely for you. If you fancy running around a set of trenches a bit like crazy, getting muddy and terrified in a tunnel, then Sanctuary Wood is the place for you. And this is really how I use it with the kids as well. So I'll show you how it looks like, but this is a set of preserved trenches around Ypres that have been kept this way right from 1918. Some little I've frozen. Oh, am I back? Okay. So we'll have a look at the actual trenches, and then I'll take you down the scary tunnel. And it really is quite a scary tunnel. So this is the sanctuary wood trenches. Often they're filled with mud down the bottom, but you can see down the bottom of the trench, the sort of duckboards area. You've got the sidings, and you can really see the shape of the trenches here in this one. So this was filmed on a nice day. I've been here on very, very nasty days as well, and it can be really, really muddy. So you've got the corrugated iron for these ones. This depended, so the trenches were made out of whatever materials they came across. And you can see the shell holes that still exist from the First World War. The trees wouldn't have been there. The trees are younger than the war. And the German trenches were up on the ridge beyond the trees. So you can get an idea of sort of what the landscape was like, and just an idea of what trenches were like. At this site as well, they also have the tunnel that you can go in, which was much more fun when kids didn't have phones that had torches on them. Because as you can tell, when you see it, it is absolutely dark. It's pitch dark, there's no lights, it's muddy, it's horrible. And when the kids didn't have a torch to shine on their phone, it was far more fun, because we used to put a staff member at the far end who would terrify them as soon as they arrived at the far end, which gave me a laugh apart from anything else. The design of this tunnel was, it actually went right over towards the German trenches. The aim was so that the soldiers were more secure before they launched an attack. And this was a tactic that came in about halfway through the war. It wasn't one that they used straight away. They used to go straight over the top from the top of the trenches. But they eventually decided that actually a tunnel would keep the men safer, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes when I show you the other set of cave-ins and tunnels. So once you've run around like that and made yourself a little bit crazy and got a really good idea of what the trenches were like, so one of the major museums that's just been built and refreshed in the last 4 years is called the Flanders Field Museum. It gets its name from the poem by a guy called John McCrae, who wrote the Flanders Field Poppy poem, which you might have heard of, and basically is why we use poppies as remembrance, because they were there all over the battlefield. They kept growing back, even although nothing had been cultivated for years. And he wrote a poem about the poppies blowing and being in rows like the crosses were. So the museum itself is quite amazing. It's been refurbished, but this takes you through as a little bit of a flying tour of the museum to show you the sort of things that you could actually experience in museums. So I'm going to just show this, and it should have sound as well. One of the great things about the last 4 or 5 years in Belgium is that they've put a huge amount of money into different museums that make it so much easier for going with kids and for anybody. They've really improved a lot of the things. So Also, we can go and visit different memorials. This one is called Vancouver Corner. It's a memorial to the Canadians who were fighting here. And we're going to go and have another wee look on Google Maps and find it. So in terms of what we have here, this was the Second Battle of Ypres, which was in April 1915. And it was the first use of gas attack in World War I on the Western Front. And the German trenches, if you can see the hands moving, were along the ridge that's up there. And that was where the gas was released from. And where we are, down here, was the French and Canadian line. And the gas flew over, and very quickly the French in particular were overpowered. And the Canadians, who had been based further to the south, towards a place called Saint-Jean, they were mobilised and they came up and lost an awful lot of men. It was one of the first big battles that they'd lost a huge number of men. And so as a memorial, they made the Breeding Soldier memorial, which is really just it's a soldier sort of hands it standing over his rifle. They've also made the bushes. They cut them every year into the shape of gas canisters to remind people who are visiting why exactly the memorial is there, which is pretty cool to see. So this is a place called Langemarck and Saint-Jean. My pronunciations are not very good, it has to be said, but you just have to work with these things. So that's one of the places that we could go to if we were visiting. And for Scottish people, there's a place called Fresenberg Ridge, which was part of the Passchendaele campaign in 1917, that's actually just had a new Scottish memorial put on it. So this is the memorial cross, and if we go to have a look, they've actually put some metal statues up, which are really quite amazing to see on the side of the road, that are all in the shape of Scottish soldiers. So there's guys with kilts and different things. So you can see the cross sort of behind the tree there. I can't get any closer, unfortunately, with Google Maps. It won't let me, but these went up just for 1918. And they're the soldiers walking very much where the 9th Scottish Division would have actually been walking as they were heading up the ridge. I say up the ridge, it's obviously really not very ridge-like in terms of it's quite flat, but the German trenches were all up on the hill up there at the top of that hill, and they've put the memorial up of the Scottish soldiers walking towards the battlefield, which is pretty cool to go and visit. There's also other regiments remembered there, but it's very much a Scottish memorial. So unfortunately, we do have to get to the real point that actually we go to cemeteries. There are thousands of them. You can go from cemeteries that have 10 or 12 people in them through to this one that has 5,000 graves in it. However, this one's really quite famous for two reasons. It has the highest percentage of unknown soldier graves in Belgium. About 80-90% of the graves in here don't have names on them. However, one of them that does have a name is the youngest known soldier of the Commonwealth side, a guy called John Condon, is buried here. He was 14 when he was killed. He was 13 when he joined up and 14 when he was killed. So all of the cemeteries look very similar. There was a decision made by the British government not to bring the men home, and all of the cemeteries look the same. They all have an entranceway, like the one you can see there with the memorial book inside it. They all have a cross. You can sort of see that in the distance. A memorial cross in the middle. And all of the gravestones are exactly the same. The decision was taken by the government, quite rightly, that it didn't matter your rank, it didn't matter where you'd come from, your gravestone would be exactly the same as everybody else's. So all of the British graves are rectangular with curved edges at the top, with a choice of usually the badge of your regiment, the name if they knew the name, and the family got to put a message on the bottom of the grave if they wanted to. It was entirely up to them. But there's no distinction between a general and a corporal, or a general and a private. There's no distinction in grave. So all of these were opened over the sort of 10 years after the war, and a lot of them, like this one, are very much the people, the area surrounding it, the smaller cemeteries were moved into a bigger cemetery, and that was the job of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who still maintain them now. But they did make that decision to move some gravestones and into the big ones. Others they didn't, and I honestly couldn't tell you why you still get small ones and big ones when they'd moved so many, but you just do, and you get small ones and big ones, and some of them have a lot in them. We'll look at a bigger one in a wee bitty. So the next stop is going to France, and when I go with the kids, we look at 3 different areas. We look at the Battle of Loos, the Battle of the Somme, and the battle along Vimy Ridge and Arras, which are 1915, 16 and 17. It wouldn't probably surprise you to find that literally they are about 20 miles apart. The front line did not move very much from the point when it was created to the very close to the end of the war. The same areas of land were being fought over again and again. So literally once you get to these areas in France, from Loos to Somme and Vimy, you can drive between them in half an hour. You're not having to go huge distances, although you're talking about 3 years of fighting, which is quite crazy. So the first one is the Battle of Loos, and we're actually going to watch a wee clip by Rory Bremner, who did a really excellent documentary on this. If anybody wants to watch it, it looks at the Scottish fighters throughout the war, throughout time, but his section on World War I was very good, which looks at this because the Battle of Loos was the biggest battle that Scottish people had fought in since Culloden. It had the most numbers of Scottish troops and the most number of Scottish troops dying, although a lot of people here have never actually heard of it. So we're going to just watch this just for a minute or so, just to show you the main cemetery.
Dud Corner Cemetery in northern France. Buried here are the casualties of the Battle of Loos.
What's striking about this cemetery at Dud Corner, so called after all the unexploded munitions that were found here after the war, is that at first glance you think it's a war cemetery surrounded by a plain wall, until you realise that each part of the wall has 15 panels, and each panel contains 200 names of those who were killed or wounded in this battle.
This is very much a Scottish selection of panels: Highland Light Infantry, Seaforth, Gordons, and then the Cameron Highlanders. Here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All men from Westeros, Inverness-shire, who would never return to their homes again.
So just to make you aware of that, that's called the Loos Memorial, and it's the names around it of people who died in that area and who were never found. So they don't have a grave of their own. The person themselves might be in a grave, but they don't know where it is. So those panels, that makes up something like 1,400 men from up here. So it was Cameron Highlanders, the ones that were formed at Fort George, who just in that one area didn't come home again. And so in terms of thinking, we get the kids to think a lot about what would that mean for even the Highlands today, if 1,400 dads, brothers, whatever, just didn't come home. Imagine what it meant 100 years ago. It's quite scary to think of it in that sort of a way, because you are talking about a large number of people. As we go on, the Battle of the Somme is probably one of the most famous ones. The memorial here is called Thiepval Memorial, and it's on top of the Thiepval Ridge that we're going to have a look at in a wee minute. And it was designed by a guy called Sir Edward Lutyens, and opened. It holds the names of the British and South African, not any of the other names. It's the British and South African Memorial. The other countries like Canada and Australia have their own Somme memorials. And there's 72,000 names on this one of people who were never found. So it's quite an eerie place to be. They've redone it again for 1916 because that was when the battle was. So the BBC did a really good drone footage that I'm just going to show you. that sort of gives you an aerial view of the memorial and some of the different sites around the Somme. And we'll look at a few of them in a bit more detail in a few minutes. The cemetery that you see at Thiepval has 200 French soldiers and 200 British soldiers buried there specifically as a sort of sign of unity between France and Britain over the issue of the Somme. So the first day of the Battle of the Somme was probably the most deadliest, well, it was the most deadliest for Britain. 20,000 men died in half an hour and 40,000 were injured. So it was 60,000 in one day. And after that, it just sort of got worse. But really, most people would suggest that if the Battle of the Somme hadn't happened, they don't think the Allies would have gone on to win the war, because what they learned in that complete disaster of the first week of the Battle of the Somme changed war tactics so that they are still changed today because of what they learned on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, which not a great thing to say that lots of people had to die for that, but they needed a bit of a shock to change the tactics. So we'll have So I always tell my kids when I go that the reason I'm their history teacher is because I sat at their memorial, that memorial, when I was 14 years old and wanted to study history. So it's pretty impressive as a place. So you'll have seen the crater, so I'll just show you that in a bit more detail. This was this was detonated at 7:30 on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and the bomb went off and it was heard in London, which was over 100 miles away and obviously across water. So that's Lochnagar crater, and it's just massive when you go to it. So there's another couple of wee things just for Billy. This is where we would have gone, Billy, and will still go. But this is the road that the Ulster Regiment were fighting up to get to the top ridge on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. So they would have come up here and were fighting all the way up here. Up here was a heavily fortified German position. And when the Ulster Regiment were the only ones that actually managed to make their objectives on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And so after the war, they built this tower, which is a replica of a tower in Ulster, where the Ulster Regiment had trained. And they were the ones to get up here. So in the distance, you can see the Thiepval Memorial, because this ridge was what they were fighting for on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And they were coming up and over the fields and up. Unfortunately, if you go further along the road, you also see where an awful lot of the Ulster Regiment didn't come back from. So this road itself forms the basis of the front line on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, so you can travel along it, and it allows you to sort of just see what was going on. The other quite famous group that went from Scotland were the Heart of Midlothian players, who you may have heard about, but the football didn't stop at the start of World War I. They were under contract and they had to keep playing. And it wasn't until November 1914 that they actually stopped the Premier League of Scottish football. And the Heart of Midlothian team were asked to join up together to make a PALS battalion. They were the 16th Royal Scots, and they went to war together. And the first big battle they fought in was the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and they were here at a place called Contalmaison, and they attacked from sort of looking where you are across to the trees where the German trenches were. An awful lot of them didn't survive that day, but they're quite a famous regiment. We often take the kids there to see that. And the final area we go to is an area called Arras and the Vimy quarries. And these were dug by New Zealand and Welsh miners underneath the city. And so we're going to have just a watch. They decided in the middle of 1917 that the only way to protect the men was to actually station them underground and have them coming up and out and breaking through the middle of no man's land instead of out of the trenches where the Germans had trained their guns. So they decided, it was Easter 1917 that they decided to do this battle, and right along about a 20-mile stretch they had a lot of soldiers in tunnels. And this was probably, most people would say this is probably the first success of World War I for the Allies, because it did work. So the 5th Cameron Highlanders from up here were down in these quarries, and they were attacking from here. So we can have a look at what it was like. So there was about 20 to 30,000 men in these quarry areas. Really quite horrible conditions, but it was keeping them safe from the bombardment up above. You've got the sleeping sort of areas over to the side. And the miners dug tunnels from those quarries. And so when they got the order to go forward, they would have gone up they would have all been given an allocated staircase, and they just had to blow the top of the staircase, and that's what they did to go forward on the 9th of April in 1917. The day before was Easter Sunday, and they actually had a minister down there who did the Easter Sunday service in the quarries themselves for all 20,000 men. They gathered in one of the big caverns and had the service there. So one of the most spectacular ones is at the other end of this ridge is Vimy Ridge, and it's the National Canadian Memorial, and it really is quite spectacular to see. We usually arrive there about 5 o'clock at night and the sun's just shining down on it if it's a nice day, and it's pretty amazing. Right round the edge of the memorial are all the names of the Canadians who died. As I said, the Canadians had their own memorial. But this one was designed in a competition. The Canadians had a competition for who would design their national memorial. And this guy won with this really quite amazing memorial. So we'll just have a wee look at it from the sky again. It's a bit Greek in design. There's a lot of sort of Greek figures on it, but in the middle of it, you've got sort of the sacrificial table, and at the far end, you've got Mother Canada weeping over her sons that were killed. Yeah, just something quite spectacular to see. The trip that I do usually ends here at a place called Tynecott. It's the largest Commonwealth War cemetery in the world. It has 11,000 graves, and on the wall at the back there's 36,000 names. And honestly, you can't really describe it until you see it, but we'll watch it. But it's just, yeah, pretty mind blowing to see. Oh, sorry, excuse me. So Tynecott is positioned actually on the Passchendaele Ridge. The cross and two sets of trees surround the pillboxes, the German machine gun posts that the king actually wanted to be kept in the cemetery to really as a remembrance of what had actually killed the majority of people, because as you could see it was so flat that really when they were attacking at Passchendaele, although there was the problem of the mud, the biggest problem was there was no cover and they were just sent to attack. In particular, the Scottish 15th and 9th divisions and actually the Australian and New Zealand divisions were some of the biggest casualties of the Battle of Passchendaele in terms of proportion to numbers. So the final place we're going to have a look at is the Menin Gate, which is the biggest memorial and is where every night at 8 o'clock the Menin Gate ceremony happens. This is a picture of one of my trips and really just shows it up. The picture, the names really show up very well. Again, this is the Cameron Highlanders because that's the group that we follow as we go on our trip. And yeah, it's just quite poignant to see it all. And all of these names are never replicated. So if you see a bunch of names, they are nowhere else. They're just there. So they're not replicated. So the Meningate ceremony, we had the privilege one year of one of our kids piping during it. So he was piping a Scottish tune called The Flowers of the Forest, which is a remembrance one. But the ceremony itself really forms with the buglers. So we're going to watch one of my pupils piping at the Meningate ceremony just to finish ourselves off with this. And this is really the point of remembrance that we do with the kids when we're there. They usually lay a wreath. They get the chance to go and experience the memorial, and really this is what forms the end of the trip, and is usually quite emotional for most of them, having done the 3 or 4 days that we've done before this. So it's about 5 minutes long, this, folks. It really just takes you in real time, and you can take the chance to think yourself and just watch it, or to remember yourselves. So.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
And that's my trip to Belgium, folks. So thank you very much for listening.